Alright, so I've got things to do, so let's get straight into it. So meet 18-year-old Oliver Luke. This, to be honest, I don't really have any words to describe him. He is a scumbag, but it's not an appropriate description to define just what a lowlife he is. So, Oliver Luke of Loscombe Lane in 4 Lanes near Redruth in Cornwall subjected 3 different young women to some traumatic sex attacks that involved strangling. And what makes this ordeal worse is that 2 of the sex attacks occurred after he was already arrested for his initial sex attack, which means he was already on the police radar. Truro Crown Court heard that this dirty pervert used both public and private spaces to carry out his deprived sex attacks. On the first occasion, it was proved that Luke was invited by a friend of the victim into her home. Despite the fact that the person who invited Luke left the victim's home, Luke decided to make himself at home. Seizing an opportunity, this predator asked the victim for a cigarette and then followed her to the bedroom where she went to retrieve the smoke. She then asked Luke to leave, but again this idiot refused. Again, let me just remind you, Oliver Luke was only 18 years old at the time, yet he displayed the audacity and egotism of someone wise beyond their years. In reality, he is probably a narcissist or someone who suffers with a godlike complex. So, after Oliver Luke refused to leave the premises, he then groped at the victim and tore her clothes off her body. He also pulled at her belt so hard that it snapped the leather. He then put his hands round her neck and squeezed so hard that she couldn't breathe. It is estimated the attack lasted 5 minutes, but the psychological and situational effects probably made it seem way longer. The victim reported the attack, but Luke was arrested, interviewed and promptly let go. He was, however, released under investigation. A few months later, this sex attacker struck for a second time. So, for his second sexual assault, Oliver Luke targeted a young woman who had recently been made homeless and so passed time by drinking cheap alcohol at the local park with friends and acquaintances. The victim had little recollection of what happened between drinking and waking up lying on the ground with a pervert straddling her. She could not make out the predator due to again being strangled, which is a common theme with Luke. She managed to make it back to a hostel and tell authorities. A rape kit was performed, which DNA revealed it was Oliver Luke that penetrated her. Witnesses also described how they heard screams and heaving and heavy breaths coming from the grounds of the town Conservative Club. 6 days later, while on bail, Oliver Luke sexually assaulted a 20-year-old victim who was in a relationship with a person. She was attacked on her way home from drinking with friends. In fact, making her way home, Oliver Luke latched onto her and forced her to take a detour. Luke then dragged her into the cemetery and tore at her clothes. In miraculous circumstances, her boyfriend went to look for her and actually took a shortcut through that same exact cemetery and found Oliver Luke, the pervert, with his trousers down at his ankles and with his penis out. The victim's underwear was pulled aside. The boyfriend managed to land a blow on Oliver Luke, but in between trying to land a punch and a kick on the sex attacker and trying to check over his distraught partner, Oliver Luke managed to escape. His crimes are as follows: guilty of 2 counts of assault by penetration, sexual assault, occasioning actual bodily harm. Unbelievably, Oliver Luke's defence team tried to blame his disgusting actions on baggage after an appalling childhood. Like that has anything to do with the cost of bread. You cannot excuse your actions as a fleeting lapse of judgment or revert back to circumstances that happened over 10 years ago. There's an expiry date on that kind of stuff. If that's the case, then no one should be held accountable for their actions. The idiot is a sex predator, and is a repeated one at that, a serial sex offender. Also, it's worth mentioning that when sentence was passed down, Oliver Luke decided to cry. His tears, which were deemed to be remorseful enough, but I do think that he had more to do with self-preservation than anything else. Luke was jailed for 8 years with additional 3 to serve on licence. He must also sign the sex offenders register for life. Serves his right. These tears are not going to help this guy when he's in prison. If he can't calm his sexual appetite, then I dread what will happen to him. Safe.